Stardew Valley was released in February of 2016 on PC. It was well received, and 5 years later has continued to receive updates and patches. I first got into the game sometime after its release, and I initially enjoyed the game, but I quickly began to feel that the game didn't live up to the praise that it had received. After returning to the game for its final patch, 1.5, I still believe that the game is seriously flawed, and I don't think that it deserves the praise that it's getting. And in this video, I wanted to go over my experience with the game and the many problems that it suffers from that I think could have been improved. Stardew Valley is not the worst game I've ever played, and I have nothing against the developer who made it, but what I want to emphasize here is that despite the game releasing well after the golden age of other games in the genre, and having well over 5 years of development and updates, the game still disappoints, yet the game still receives high praise from the general populace while other games in the genre have languished. I'm here to tell you that, no, this game is actually kinda trash, and there are a lot of other games you could have been playing that are way better. Before I get into my criticisms, let's be fair and go over what the game does right. Story. If you're not familiar, here's a rundown of what Stardew Valley is all about. Stardew Valley takes place in a fictional world in which you play as some random person working for the super duper evil corporation, Joja. After being fed up with your office cubicle job, you open a letter given to you by your late grandfather in which you inherit a plot of farmland in seaside Pelican Town. You arrive and begin your new life, which is primarily composed of the game's 5 major skills: farming, mining, foraging, fishing, and combat, on top of dealing with the existing town's community. Other than that, there isn't much of a story to talk about. The game's main progression revolves around the town's disheveled community center, which you repair over time with the assistance of the Junimos, which are spirits of the forest, and becoming absolutely rich by producing crops on your farm and selling them. The least I can say is that there isn't anything here that's outrageously bad. There's just not much of a story to go on in general. Presentation. The art style isn't bad. It's nothing to write home about, but it certainly does the job. I will admit that I tend to prefer games that have painted or drawn art over the less stylized pixel art that this game has. In terms of music, I'd say that it's pretty good. I have my problems with it, but we'll get to that later. Overall, it's decent. Farming. Farming is one of the core gameplay mechanics of Stardew, so it's good that it's relatively freeform when it comes to customization. There are a lot of different crops to grow and to forage, and they can be all turned into artisan goods which sell for more, which adds a layer of logistics to the game. The farm itself, as well as the rest of the game, works on a tile-based system in which furniture and equipment can be placed anywhere you want, so you have a lot of room to make the farm your own, whether you decide to go for maximum efficiency, or turn your farm into a glorified garden, or you try to balance the two. Crafting. You can craft items in any location, provided that you have the materials. It costs no stamina to do this, and it's instant. I like this crafting system for enabling you to do what you want as fast as you can, whenever you can. Community. In this game, you can have same-sex relationships. I don't really care about this all that much, but if it matters to you, it's there. Secrets. There are a lot of secrets in Stardew for you to look out for during gameplay. Notably are the secret notes which you unlock at the first winter and the legendary fish. You rarely see these puzzles nowadays, and either they're too well hidden or the solution is just pointed out to you. But in Stardew, they don't hide anything too critical and leave it for you to find out on your own by reading the notes in the library. Okay, now let's get into the things that the game does wrong. Presentation. Let's start with something small. The music, while nice, doesn't play regularly. Tends to only play once or twice on a single in-game day, which leaves you with a lot of dead air. Much to the dismay of headphone users during summer, you'll hear mostly nothing but the noise of buzzing mosquitoes. Other than that, game is just plain silent. Farming. Anything that grows on a trellis takes up physical space. You need to account for this, because you can end up blocking yourself from reaching other crops you've grown. Tree taps require you to stand around and wait. If you need more sap or resin, there's nothing you can do other than to just stand there with your hands in your pants. If you don't have scarecrows, ravens come to eat your crops. The range of a scarecrow is approximately a rounded square with a radius of about 8 tiles. You, of course, don't know this, so you just have to guess and hope that you got your whole field covered with scarecrows. On top of this, the scarecrow recipe doesn't unlock until you get level 1 farming, and you start the game with level 0 farming, so if you decide to sell your starting parsnips for something like cauliflower, you can end up getting them eaten because you actually need to pluck the crops to get experience to level up and make the scarecrows in the first place. There are a fair number of animals you can raise in your coops and barns. The vast majority of them are not necessary for any bundles, so realistically you'd only get them for exclusive produce to sell. This isn't an issue, but there's a number of functions with the animals that aren't so good. Animals that are left out of the barn can die if they're stuck outside when you go to bed. This realistically shouldn't ever happen because there's no penalty for leaving the barn doors open, so why this is a mechanic is beyond me. Seemingly they're just to punish you for no good reason. Fences degrade over time, most notably in between the year gap between winter and next spring. After winter, if you have like fences or stuff, they just break. I forgot to tell you that the fences degrade in this game.
What?
Most of your fences will nearly break. I don't know why this is in the game. The fences aren't even that important, but since they degrade, it's just another reason to not even bother with them. They don't even keep stuff out of your farm, like wild animal attacks we talked about before. If you get the golden clock, your fences won't decay, and your spells will occasionally fix them for you, but why would you bother making them at all if they don't do anything in the first place? Animals are fed using grass. If you let your farm animals out of the barn, they'll wander around and take a bite out of your grass growing around the farm. The grass grows in all directions. It's more beneficial to reap chunks of grass from inside of big patches to allow it to grow inwards with more surface area. Of course, animals tend to eat grass from the outside in, which typically results in them eating faster than it can grow. Even though grazing increases your friendship, it's way more work to do this. The annoying thing is that you need to have a silo built somewhere on the farm in order to collect hay from your grass. In the early game, if you make the mistake of cutting down on your grass before you make a silo, you potentially lose out on a lot of hay. Additionally, you can't take hay out of a silo, and the silo has a cap of 240 pieces of hay. This isn't that much when you get down to it, so instead what you can do is you can pull hay out of the fodder bin that you find inside your coops and barns. Then you can just store this hay in a chest for your storage space of 999 by 36 spaces. This allows you to circumvent the need for multiple silos and is necessary in order to complete some of the community bundles which need you to have hay as an item. Otherwise you just have to buy it. On top of all this, all the grass dies during the winter without any warning, so you have to make sure you reap all of the grass you can so you don't have to buy any. There are a number of seeds that are only sold later in the game, like the strawberry seeds during the Egg Festival. Pierre stocks more seeds during the second year, and some of these are necessary to complete bundles. It reinforces the idea that the players shouldn't even bother with bundles during their first year, and instead focus on gathering all the materials and monies and upgrades they need to make the second year a cakewalk, which is counterintuitive. More important than this, crops die immediately if you grow them outside of their allowed seasons. When the season ends, all of the crops wilt, and you have to get rid of them. This means that if you plant a crop even a single day late in the season, you'll lose them all, and no profit can be made. There are some ways to circumvent this restriction by using the greenhouse, but these are all late game unlocks after you've completed the community center, or at least mostly completed it. It sort of defeats the purpose of being able to grow any crop to progress the community center when you need to progress the community center in order to unlock this function. In addition, crops are sold by the season, so you wouldn't be able to buy the seeds to grow regardless. You can change this with a special item you get in the post-game, but the price of the seeds is increased by 50%, and you've already beaten the game, so there's no point in growing these crops because you don't need them for anything. Along with the greenhouse, you unlock garden pots, which allow you to grow crops indoors in any season. This sounds really appealing, and you might think that this alleviates the problem of not being able to grow crops in any season, but oh wait, you unlock this after you unlock the greenhouse, which already serves this function, and these garden pots can't be watered with sprinklers. You also can't put ancient seeds in them, which is the one thing you probably would have wanted to put them in. It's just completely useless. Fairly early into the game you get a choice between cave mushrooms and bats on your farm. Objectively, bats beat mushrooms hand over fist. Bats give you a chance for fruit, while mushrooms give you shrooms regularly. The mushrooms are low value and easy to find anywhere, while fruit can only be grown through the fruit trees and bought at a traveling merchant. Fruit is required for some of the important community bundles, and trees take a whole season to grow on top of being really expensive to buy up front. So, for the love of God, just take the bats. You can't change this after the fact, which just rubs salt into the wounds for anyone who didn't realize what they were missing out on. Every production machine in the game requires you to wait around for you to finish working with them. This is the complete opposite of crafting, which is instant and done in your inventory, the most agonizingly painful part of this process is just getting these machines in the first place. Kegs, which produce some of the most valuable goods you need to get all the money you need for the late game, require tree resin to get, so you have to set up the tree farm, then tap the trees, which is also expensive to do, and then painstakingly wait for all of the resources you need to actually make the kegs. The better option in the early game would be to just make a bunch of sprinklers and upgrade all of the tools you need. Then, just make a field full of blueberries in the summer and a field full of cranberries in the autumn. You'll get hundreds and thousands of gold without the need to wait for kegs and preserves. But it's just a shame that the materials you need to make these things, you can't buy, which sort of defeats the purpose of making all this money in the first place. It really doesn't feel like you're being rewarded for all the work you put in to get all this money. You just have to wait. Nothing you can do but wait. On the flip side, there is stuff that you just can't make yourself, like vinegar. It's not very important, but you do have to buy it, and it's kind of weird that something completely useless you have to buy, but something that's super precious, that you need a lot of, you can't buy with the piles and piles of gold you'll make. With all that said, the most disappointing thing about the farming in this game for me personally is that you can't put fertilizer down on a crop that has already started growing. You can put fertilizer down on tilled soil and soil with seeds on it, but after the first stage of growth, you can't put fertilizer down. I don't know if this is some kind of appeal to realism, but it just feels bad. There's no reason why I shouldn't be able to do this. Would it really break the game that much if I could? I don't know, but what I do know is that I'm not allowed to, and this just frustrates me to no end. There exists tree fertilizer, which allows trees to grow faster with them on. Astonishingly enough, you can put this fertilizer on trees which have grown slightly, but even more baffling is that you can't put this on fruit trees, because I guess that would have been too easy. Crafting and items. Your inventory is limited from the very beginning, with your tools taking up most of your space. Once you can finally upgrade your inventory, you can get 32 slots of space, which is a lot better, but still not ideal. You'll still want to put most of your tools somewhere else if you're out in the mines, collecting all these rocks and ores and whatever useless garbage they cram into your inventory. Crafting can only be done with items in your inventory. While this isn't much of an issue given that you have 32 slots for this, the problem lies with chests. You have to craft chests out of wood and put them down in the world. Each chest has an inventory that's independent from all of the other chests, and if you've ever played Minecraft or Terraria, then you know the nightmare of having rows and rows of chests filled with crap that's just not sorted. Some might argue that you should be more careful how to design your storage system from the beginning of the game, but considering that you can't easily relocate a chest that has stuff in it, this is a huge hassle for new players to consider, and I can't imagine how many players get fed up with how unhelpful the system is, and I don't see a reason why there couldn't have been a better one. Why not give me one chest with enough space to hold everything I could want in it, or make the chest's storage space persistent throughout every chest? In order to upgrade your tools, you need to get metals. To make a metal bar, put ore and coal in a furnace and just wait. We already talked about how much of a pain it is to get this equipment, but now we're starting to get into the problem that this takes so long. There's sort of a dilemma where if you put an item in your furnace that takes a little while to do, you're better off just standing in front of your furnace and not doing anything, because if you run off to do something else, that bar is going to be done long before you get back, so you might as well just stay in front of it so you can put in more bars. And if it's something that takes a really long time to do, you better make sure that you have enough time to put something new in before the day ends, otherwise you're going to have a lot of wasted time as it quote-unquote idles in between days. For things like iridium bars, this is important because those bars take almost a third of the day to do. Nearly every crafting recipe is locked behind either buying it, seeing it on TV, or getting it from a friendship gift. And it's these TV recipes that are kind of a problem. If you miss one, there's no other way to get it other than by watching TV. You have two opportunities to watch the TV for a recipe, Sunday or Wednesday. The Sunday recipe is determined in a specific order, and the Wednesday recipe is a random one that's been shown before. There are 24 exclusive recipes to the TV show, which leaves you a little chance of getting the recipe you want on any given Wednesday, and if you decide to wait for a Sunday, the recipes loop every 2 years. So if you miss something in, say, the 3rd year of spring, you're going to be watching every Wednesday until you get it, until the 5th year when the loop starts over again. Why couldn't there be a better way to get these recipes? Besides, isn't watching TV kind of against the theme of living on the farm? Tools can be upgraded only in linear order. There's no skipping lower levels. Not only are these upgrades expensive, but you'll lose your tool for the rest of the day until the day after tomorrow, which means you'll have to go 1 day without a tool, which restricts what you can do in the following day, which is just annoying. I don't see why you should have to wait for this upgrade. Would the game have been broken if I could just have the tool in the same day? All this really does is just give you an excuse to go fishing for an entire day. Fishing is terrible. It's time consuming, it's difficult, and it's not rewarding at all. I would be hard pressed to call any aspect of it fun in any degree. To fish, you cast your rod into a pool of water, and then you interact when something bites. If you get a fish and not trash, you play a minigame. You have to keep your tracking bar in line with the fish icon, and this fills up a meter on the side. When you fill up the meter, you catch the fish. If the fish never once left the tracking bar, you get a perfect catch, which increases the star level of the fish and gives you more experience. A combination of high inertia of the tracking bar and the erratic behavior of the fish creates a really frustrating game where you end up fighting a single fish for literally several in-game hours.
Music? Yeah, I don't like music either. Ah!
What are you, Amish? Yeah.
Oh.
What are you doing with the phone? This is my...
This is
I had to
like,
run out here and answer it.
yeah, my shack phone.
Rick, how do you do this?
What, you just catch him?
I'm so mad. I have never been this mad before. The vast majority of fish don't sell for much, and you can use any fish in a recipe that requires a fish unless it specifies a specific one, so you really have no incentive to go fishing outside of going for completion. The type of fish you can catch is affected by the weather, so if you need a fish that's caught in rain or during the storms, you just have to wait for one to happen. This is also affected by season. If you need to catch something in spring, and it's summer, you have to wait until spring comes again next year for you to have a chance to catch it again, unless you use an endgame item, which lets you catch any fish in any season, but again, this is endgame, you're probably already done all this, so that just makes it kind of redundant. You can use bait on your fishing rod, which makes it more likely for a fish to bite. You have to either craft or buy bait, and all this really does is save you time that you shouldn't be wasting to begin with. Amazingly enough, if you catch garbage while using bait, you still consume the bait, as if somehow the trash is able to eat your bait. It would make more sense if the bait made it so that you couldn't catch garbage at all, since it would make it more likely for fish to be going onto your line, but I guess that would make it too useful, wouldn't it? Bubbles will occasionally appear in bodies of water. If you cast your line near these bubbles, you'll be more likely to hit fish. Because you can only catch in the 4 cardinal directions, the majority of the bubbles you spot will be out of range due to being at a weird angle or just due to being too far away. Randomly when catching fish, you might get a treasure chest that appears over the fishing bar. You have to hold the tracking bar over it like it's a fish, and it'll fill its own bar. If you catch the chest and the fish, you'll get some goodies along with it. But if you fail to catch the fish, you won't get the treasure no matter what. The treasure chest itself can appear anywhere on the fishing bar, which means that if the fish and the treasure don't meet in the same spot, you often have to forego the perfect catch bonus in favor of getting the treasure. Rarely you can have the opposite occur, where a treasure chest appears too late, and you end up catching the fish before the treasure chest can be gotten. Not that it's really worth it in the end, most of the time the treasure is just bait or geodes or useless garbage. Rarely you get artifacts or gems that you could just get from mining as well. It just sort of begs the question as to why this is even a mechanic when the rewards are so minuscule and the design seems so counterintuitive. As it turns out, fishing is way worse than I could have ever described it with words. I seriously do not know how anyone can find this fishing minigame fun. 1. There is no way to tell which fish you're missing for completion. You literally just have to guess, and keep in mind that you have to consider weather and time on top of the season, and there's RNG in whether or not you'll be able to even hook the fish you want. There is one saving grace here, an unlockable TV channel which details the catching conditions for some of the fish, but only some. It won't tell you about fish caught anywhere besides the town's river, the mountain lake, and the town ocean. meaning fish caught in the sewers, the caves, the desert, or Ginger Island are off the table. Fish that are caught in all seasons aren't mentioned either. Catching fish is even worse than I remember it being. Some fish erratically move up and down. It's almost impossible to predict how the fish will move. There is no skill involved here, really, no skill. I can't believe how anyone can accept this as part of the game. It's the most horrible fishing minigame I've ever experienced. When it's easy, it's boring, and it takes too long, but when it's hard, it's unbearably frustrating and agonizing. You really just have to try for yourself. The inertia of the fishing bar really enhances how terrible this is. On top of not being able to comprehend what the fish is going to do, you barely have any control over yourself due to the gravity of your fishing bar. Fishing is just terrible. Absolutely terrible. Mining. Mining is an activity that you do a lot in Stardew. It is one of the only activities that is lucrative at all and rewards you with materials you'll desperately need in order to beat the rest of the game. Mining involves running around caves, randomly breaking rocks and ores in the hopes that you'll get ladders taking you down to the next floor. Later floors contain more valuable ores and materials, and reaching certain depths is a major requirement for progressing the game. So what's wrong with mining? First of all, you do a lot of mining, since it's really the only thing you can do other than fishing when you aren't farming. In order to get the ores you want, you have to get down to the lower floors first. And, well, you're completely at the mercy of RNG whether or not you'll get the ladders in a timely fashion. I hope you have fun breaking every rock in the cave, only for that one rock you left at the beginning to be the one with the ladder under it. That's really it. Mining is just you walking around, clicking on rocks until you get the ladder you want. The slow movement speed of your character really compounds the problem here, as in Skull Cave, you desperately need to descend as far as possible to get to the later floors, where Iridium spawns more frequently. Of course, if you aren't so lucky, you'll instead have to save up boatloads of stone in order to create emergency staircases, which automatically creates a staircase for you to go down. Mining is one of the few activities that will actually strain your stamina, but only before you get your Iridium pickaxe. By floor 40, you'll probably notice that the copper pick you started with takes way more hits to break each stone, which potentially doubles or triples the stamina cost you need in order to get through a mining trip. All this really does is slow you down, but thankfully this isn't much of an issue in the long run since you can upgrade your tools relatively early into the game. Combat. While I can forgive what the mining does wrong in this game, I can't forgive the combat. Combat in Stardew is downright miserable at times, and is honestly a questionable inclusion. Combat involves rapidly mashing the attack button while holding a weapon in the vain hope that whatever you're swinging at receives enough damage to be destroyed. Do you want a combat system that makes you feel like an idiot? Stardew Valley is here to save the day. The first and least offensive problem here is that the enemy variety is really lacking. I'm not asking for a bestiary of 1,000 enemies and recolors, but the vast majority of the enemies in this game do nothing interesting, and a lot of them are just downright annoying to fight. Some of them throw a projectile every now and then, but almost all of them deal damage by just walking into you. Some enemies, like the moles, appear only in the first floors, and you literally have to play whack-a-mole with them, waiting for them to pop their heads so you can swing at them. Constantly waiting, and waiting. You have the rock crabs, which disguise themselves as rock and ore to get your hopes up, only to end up being kind of frustrating since sometimes they'll just stand still and not do anything, becoming invincible. You'll have to get out your pickaxe and hit them in order to get them to move again, which requires you to fumble around with your inventory. Slimes are the most common enemy in this game, and they're some of the most annoying, having the most extremely bloated health pool and a very annoying dash that's almost impossible to dodge. To go one step further, slimes attempt to stand right on top of you, which just so happens to be right outside of your attack range, and they inflict a slowing status effect, which makes it even more difficult to get out of this frustrating situation where slime is standing on top of you and you just can't hit it no matter what you do, and if you try to walk away, it'll just climb right on top of you again. Even if I were to ignore the enemy design, your options in combat are pretty limited, and honestly, this is the source of a lot of the pain here. There are 4 main weapon types, not including your farming tools: slingshots, daggers, clubs, and swords. Slingshots require ammo, and they require you to aim. Somewhat annoyingly, you can't combine ammo in your slingshot with ammo in your inventory. You have to take it out of your slingshot and then combine them, and then put it back in the slingshot. Ignoring that, slingshots just deal really low damage, and the fact that you have to aim them and that they take ammo just makes them very unappealing. Dagger weapons have low damage, but they attack quickly. You'll also quickly realize that daggers are some of the most useless weapons in the game next to the slingshot. Their low damage and low range makes them ineffective against almost every enemy, since most enemies can approach you from different angles, especially slimes and flying enemies. But the dagger, it only stabs right in front of you. There's no swing, it's just a stab. The best case scenario is that you pin an enemy against a wall and you mash them into it using your dagger. But this is the same for all melee weapons, and daggers have it worse because attacking makes you inch forward. Did I mention that most enemies in this game deal contact damage? The dagger also has a special attack in which you rapidly stab. This is the same as just attacking normally, so it has no real utility other than wasting your time and forcing you to stand still for longer. Clubs and swords are where we actually get to some usable weapons. They attack in a small arc in front of you, similar to how Link swings his sword in Link to the Past. Clubs are slow and they have good damage. What makes them good is that their special attack, it looks like a ground slab and it has an AoE. It may be a bug, but if you attack while performing the special attack, you get even more ground slams, which sort of makes it look like an earthquake is happening. This deals rapid damage to all enemies that are near you, but it does knock them away, so it works best when the enemy is up against a wall. The high knockback of this weapon makes it pretty frustrating to use, and most of these hammer weapons have slow attack speeds, which can be really frustrating against groups of enemies. Overall, this will carry you through the mid-game, but you shouldn't rely on these kinds of weapons. Swords are the most reliable of all the weapons, having good attack speed and damage. The only problem with swords is that their special attack is a parry. The best use for this parry is for blocking slimes and other enemies that fly directly into you, but other than that serves very little utility. The only notably odd thing about swords and clubs is that because of the perspective of the game, they seem to be pretty weak when attacking downwards, but pretty good when attacking in any other direction. Even if you have a good weapon, combat has a few other notable issues. Swapping your weapons requires you to fumble around with your hotbar in order to select what you want. It can be difficult to do this in the heat of the moment, so you might end up clicking on the wrong thing. It just makes me wish that there was a better way of doing this. It's difficult to change the direction you're aiming in once you start swinging. Even if you hold down movement in one direction, you can still end up swinging in the same way if you're still attacking. There's also a buffer that can cause you to swing multiple times without wanting to, which is especially noticeable when you use the club weapons and the special attack. You can be mashing the attack button and get 2 or 3 swings that you didn't actually want, which can end up making you get stuck and get hit by enemies. Once you beat the mines, the only upgrade to your weapon is either buying an obscenely expensive one from the guild, or by getting a prismatic shard and trading it in at a desert for a galaxy sword. The galaxy sword basically outclasses every weapon in the game up until this point, but prismatic shards have a staggeringly low drop rate from enemies. If you don't get mercy from the RNG gods, you'll be forced to suffer through Skull Cave's enemies, slimes with more HP than planets and serpents which can chunk you for half of your health and come into swarms as well. It's a goddamn nightmare down in that cave, especially when you lack a proper weapon to get rid of them quickly. Once you do get the Galaxy Sword, most of the enemies down in Skull Cave become a joke. It's kind of a shame that the drop rate for prismatic shards is usually less than 1% from most enemies. All in all, you really have to ask why combat is even in this game. It's super clunky and frustrating, and it only serves to slow you down during your mining expeditions. It's not even that rewarding, as enemy drops rarely anything valuable. Most of the times they just drop food that you end up eating in order to go on future trips. Fighting is nothing more than just clicking at the enemy and hoping that they walk into you, since they deal contact damage. Why would you walk into them when they're already going to walk into you? All in all, it really just ends up being a button masher, and there's not even a cool endgame dungeon or boss for you to be working towards. You have the hard mode mines, but all of the enemies there function pretty much the same, and again, it's still just clicking on the enemy until they die. To make a bad thing even worse, part of 100% completion is killing a large number of each type of enemy. The terrible combat mechanics are one thing, but now you have to hunt down hundreds of monsters just to get that perfection score. And the monster spawns aren't guaranteed on any given floor, just the types of monsters depending on what range of floors you're on. So expect this to take a very long time if you're just trying to kill one kind of monster and you can't get it to spawn. Story. Stardew doesn't have much of a story to go on. This isn't a huge problem, but it does mean that there isn't an overarching plot for you to be invested in. You're probably far more interested in the characters of Stardew, and yeah, they're not amazing. Calling the villagers AI would be giving them too much credit. They're pretty shallow and they adhere to a very strict schedule dictated by the day, season, weather, and year. All of the townsfolk can easily be described by the one thing they're most interested in, and the one conflict they usually have in a character arc. There's nothing wrong with gimmick characters. Fire Emblem is an entire franchise in which all of the side characters have very little going on with them. The exception with Fire Emblem is that they usually have a plot to worry about, and the support system allows you to explore each character in greater depth. Stardew's townfolk are barely explored, and oftentimes they're just terribly boring, oftentimes being downright rude as well. Most of the town's residents just don't say or do anything interesting. The vast majority of characters that you can enter a relationship with have very little going on, and it usually doesn't relate to their personality. The rest of them barely have anything going on, period, outside of their duties as an NPC or a shopkeeper. It's hard to describe any of the characters outside of what they look like or the one thing that's most obvious about them. Leia likes art, Abigail likes adventure, Shane's a drunkard, Sebastian's a neat. Even then, I'm being kind of generous. These are things you'll only really figure out after you progress their friendship levels a decent amount, since these characters rarely ever speak about these things in their dialogue, and it's this dialogue that really kills these characters. It doesn't take very long for you to realize just how little dialogue there is for each character. While I would like to say that there's a fair amount of it, given that the dialogue varies based on time, season, festival, even, the reality is that you'll often talk to characters in the same way on most days, resulting in a lot of repeated dialogue that you get bored of very quickly. You might have expected someone like Abigail to talk about some of the different monsters you can find, or about weapons, or something about mystery. Instead, you'll get some stunning dialogues like, "Wow, I just realized that it's Friday. Sometimes I totally lose track of time." And, "Oh hey, taking a break from work?" What I'm trying to say is that this isn't just boring. You wouldn't be able to tell which character was saying it. Just take any random dialogue and try to match it to the person who said it. I imagine you'll very rarely be able to pinpoint it to the right person. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to have a special way of speaking every single line, but all in all, in general, what dialogue is there is mostly devoid of character. NPCs often just say things that you'd assume other characters would have said, and it really deprives them of their unique traits. And the dialogue that is there that does distinguish them is about as blatant as ever. Did you know Elliot was a writer? If not, he'll probably tell you that he likes to write in a book. He won't tell you about the process of writing it, or things he's written before. He'll just tell you at random that he's writing a book. But that's not even the half of it. You may have noticed that one of the messages you might get after passing out at 2 a.m. is that someone was seen picking your pockets. There are no random NPCs that wander around a town, which means that someone has to be stealing from you when you pass out. And Lewis is the only one who reports ever seeing you. A lot of the NPCs in Stardew are decidedly terrible people, and it makes it hard to get invested into any of them. Pierre leeches off of your success, and all he does but pester his family. Demetrius threatens you when you get close to Maru, and so many of the other NPCs just start off very cold and rude. It makes it hard to want to get any closer to them, when most of them just push you farther away from the very beginning. Each character has a small selection of events that occur based on your friendship level with them. The majority of non-romanceable characters have little to no events, but those potential partners have around 4 or so events as you progress. This is definitely an improvement over the characters in the beginning, but most of the event stories don't go very deep, and almost all of them end up just being emotional pandering. The friendship levels aren't even the actual problem here. The real problem is actually progressing these friendship levels with your NPCs, as this is required for perfection, and on its own is a monumental task. Firstly, how do you increase your friendship with NPCs? You can talk to each NPC for a small increase in friendship, and you can give 2 gifts every week, which increases your friendship further. NPCs will not tell you what kind of things they like or dislike. Instead, you have to get this information from secret notes found after the first year from random drops. You can occasionally get advice from other NPCs about another character's likes and dislikes, but in my experience, I've only ever been told about dislikes, which doesn't really help since most of the NPCs only like a small selection of things, while disliking the vast majority of items in the game. At the very least, the game tracks items you've given to people and how they felt about it, but it's a system of trial and error if you don't plan at looking at the wiki. You can also raise friendship by completing quests in the specific friendship bundle, which both reward friendship upon completion. You might not think that this system is so bad at first, but you'd be wrong. By restricting the number of gifts to 2 per week, it takes much longer than it should in order to raise friendship levels with another person. You might say that the system is designed for you to slowly build up your relationships over time, to which I'd tell you that Stardew Valley implements a decaying mechanic, which causes you to lose friendship with NPCs over time. If you haven't spoken to an NPC, your friendship with them will drop by a small amount at the end of the day, unless you've reached a certain cap with them. While the act of talking to your spouse is relatively easy, as they're in your house at the beginning of the day, maintaining constant communication with any other NPC is a massive chore, since it requires you to be able to locate and travel to each NPC you're trying to keep up with. In the early to mid-game, you simply don't have time for this, as you're probably spending most of your time in the mines gathering ore and setting up your farm. Quests you complete early on grant you friendship that quickly turns to nothing after a month or so of not speaking to those NPCs, and events such as completing the community center rewards friendship with everyone, which results in losses if you've already maxed out friendship with some people. Because of this, I would argue that you're not intended to build up relationships slowly. Instead, you build them up rapidly in a single fell swoop near the end of the game. Since the act of building up that relationship is such a monumental effort, you're better off dedicating yourself to it every day. And this sort of leads into what I would consider one of the biggest problems with Stardew. Movement. Movement in Stardew is too damn slow. It's slow for two reasons. You're slow, and the town is too damn big. The actual movement speed in this game is ridiculously slow. Even with all of the shortcuts that exist, getting around town is just not engaging. I can go over some more specific examples later, but let's start with the town. Pelican Town is huge, but a lot of it is actually just empty. There's a playground in the top left corner of the town that's just not used by anyone other than Haley as far as I know. Even if you're gonna argue that actually a lot of NPCs do go up in that space, it doesn't really matter, because the player is never going to go up into that space. It's wasted, and it only serves to make the walk up to the community center even longer. The entire pathway between the town plaza and the mountain area is just dead space that is never used. The shortcut between the farm and the mountains is nearly 1 minute of empty space that isn't used for anything other than a chance for foraged goods, dig spot, and maybe an event or two. But that's about it. The town sauna is on a completely different section of the mountains, and it doesn't even have a good shortcut to get to it. The hugeness of this town makes the slow movement of your character just that much more of a problem. And the reason why this slow movement is a problem is because it magnifies some of the flaws you'll find throughout the game. Stardew's clock runs about 1 in-game hour to about 43 seconds in real life, giving you a little less than 15 minutes for an in-game day. In practice, this isn't a lot of time. When we combine all the other time restrictions with the slow movement, you end up having to change your plans from what you want to do to what you're allowed to do in a given time. Shops open and close at arbitrary times, potentially locking you out if you're too late. Pam pilots the bus when it's repaired, but she leaves the bus stop in the afternoon, locking you out of the desert for the rest of the day. Annoyingly enough, the Adventurers Guild opens up at noon, meaning that if you did want to go there, you couldn't go there at the beginning of the day, and you'd have to go there sometime later, potentially interrupting what you were doing with a lengthy detour all the way over to the shop. This is all with the daily timer looming overhead. When the day gets dark, you have to constantly remind yourself that if you can't walk back home in time, you'll pass out. This cuts anything you're doing dead in its tracks, and forces you to haul your ass back home. I want to say that this is a problem with pacing. Maybe you want to go mining or fishing, but the game is stopping you and forcing you to go back home instead. And of course this walking is so slow that it might as well be a loading screen at the end of every day. It interrupts you, and that just isn't fun. You have to constantly think ahead about whether or not what you're about to do will even be possible by the time you walk over there. Not because what you're trying to do isn't something you should be doing, but because if you take too long, it can end up becoming impossible. You can alleviate the slow movement with a horse upgrade. It sounds nice, right? Well, ignoring the fact that the cost prevents you from getting it in the early game, there's a couple of restrictions surrounding the horse. It takes up 2 tiles of width, meaning that it gets stuck in 1-tile gaps. You also can't take it indoors or go into the mines with it, and you can't perform most actions while on the horse. You have to physically get on and off your horse, and it won't follow you around, meaning if you leave it somewhere, you have to go back for it. The bright side is that the horse returns to the stable at the end of the day, and of course you can unlock an item later in the game to fix this problem, but again, this is at the end of the game, after you've already wasted so much time walking around trying to deal with this horse. All in all, the horse might save you some time in the long run, but all of the downsides make it a pretty hard sell. At the very least, it's useful at the end of the game for hunting down all the NPCs to make friends with them. Earlier, I said that hunting down NPCs was a big hassle, and the slow movement is a big factor as to why it's so painful. Not only does your slow speed mean that the NPC hunt takes even more of your day, but NPC locations aren't even shown on your map. If you want to find anyone in town, you have to go through the trouble of finding them, manually. You have to scour the entire town for them, because there's no real way to know where they are, other than memorizing their schedule, which changes on a day-to-day basis and varies on weather and changes after the first year. Someone like Abigail can go from loafing around in her home to standing next to the wizard's tower without any indication that she's gone there. You just have to know that she's there and go through the trouble of walking your way over there. Energy management. In the beginning, your stamina is very low and you'll be starved for energy when doing basic tasks like clearing the farm and watering crops. As well, you need stamina for exploring the mines, so it feels really bad that there's not a whole lot of things you can do to restore your stamina early on. You almost certainly don't have the money to afford food, or the kitchen to make your own food, so you'll mostly be living off of salmon berries and whatever trash you can find in the mines. Other than by eating food, there are two ways to restore stamina. You can stand in your bed without sleeping, and you'll slowly regenerate stamina. This is usually a last resort in the early game for getting in that extra little bit of farming. The other major way to restore your stamina is to go to the mountain sauna and stand in the waters for a while. This is much faster than standing in bed, however, as you may recall, the movement speed of the player is so ungodly, and you have to walk up the mountains to do this. The closest shortcut is the minecart that takes you to the mines, and to add insult to injury, the game slows down your movement while you're inside of the sauna. It's still technically faster than just waiting in bed, but it's a magnificent waste of time in the early game regardless. As mentioned earlier, if you stay past 2 AM in game, your character passes out. This causes the day to change, and for you to lose a chunk of your change in the process. This feature of the game is just flat out silly. What kind of condition do you need to have in order to immediately pass out at 2 AM? Just to be annoying, even if you do make it to bed before 2 AM, you lose a portion of your stamina the next day if you went to bed between midnight and 2 AM. This isn't a game breaker by any means, but it's just another little thing to punish you. The same penalty applies if you manage to exhaust your energy bar completely. Empty it to zero and you'll lose some of your stamina the next day. Keep pushing it, and you'll straight up pass out on the spot, regardless of time or place. This is obviously a carryover from the Harvest Moon games, but why? Is this a mechanic that people clamor for? Passing out when you're just trying to play the game? The only way to raise your maximum stamina is through the use of star drops. These are rare items, which there are only 7 of with fixed requirements to get, and they tie to the progression of your character with specific milestones. I will say that getting all of the star drops isn't a huge deal, as by the mid to late game, you'll rarely ever use most of your daily stamina and you'll have plenty of food to survive on, but I'll also say that it doesn't feel rewarding considering how arbitrary some of these conditions are. The vast majority of these requirements aren't even stamina intensive tasks like getting all the artifacts or getting married. If your intention is to actually beat Stardew Valley, your game plan is pretty much decided from the beginning. A combination of restrictions on what you can do and the evaluation at the beginning of the 3rd year dictate what you're going to be doing throughout the first 2 years. You can redo this evaluation by paying a diamond, but by forcing it to happen at the end of the 2nd year, I would argue that the developer intended for you to be able to get a full score within the first 2 years. At the very beginning of the game, you have most of the tools you need to work on for all your skills, but you're most likely going to want to start working on your farm and mining. You need metals from the mines in order to get a lot of the future upgrades for your farm, so the majority of the first year you're going to be doing a lot of digging and upgrading. Sprinklers require metal, and sprinklers are the reason you can do anything else in the day with a lot of crops on the farm. Otherwise, you'd spend all of your energy and a lot of time watering crops. Compared to the other skills, farming, mining, and combat are the most important as they're the source of your progression. The vast majority of community bundles require you to either mine, fight, or farm, or otherwise buy the necessary upgrades to get them later. Fishing, other than being painful, isn't very lucrative at all, and is much better spent on the 2nd year once you've done all the mining you need. The same goes for foraging, which you really only want to level up once your axe is upgraded so you can go into the secret woods. This also requires metals from the mines. To top it all off, during the winter you can't grow anything, leaving the entirety of winter for you to go fishing and to chop down trees, so you basically never want to level these before then. From year 1 winter onwards to the year 3 evaluation, the pacing of the game absolutely tanks. While it's nice to not have so much to worry about at this point, you quickly run out of things to do as the farm mostly handles itself and there's not a whole lot of work you have to do. You don't really need to do any mining at this point because you should have plenty of sprinklers to do all the work for you and you can buy the rest of the ore yourself. The main limiting factor for your growth at this point is kegs. These require you to get oak resin, and you can't buy oak resin, you have to tap it from trees, so you're just going to have to wait for that. As much as you've been starved for money in the early game for the backpack upgrades and for lots of seeds, by the end of the game you're saving up hundreds and thousands, if not millions of coins with nothing to really spend it on other than materials for kegs and shed upgrades. This is one of the things that make the 5 skills feel pointless. Outside of tool upgrades, there's very little overlap between these skills as you progress. This is another one of Stardew's more critical flaws. There's really no endgame, and what is there just isn't that fun or worth it at all. Once you've seen everything the game has to offer, you'll quickly realize that there isn't actually a whole lot of depth or content here. With the addition of perfection, Stardew just sort of turns into an idling game at this point. It's all about slowly gaining money and kegs in order to afford all the obelisks and the golden clock, and what little there is for you to do without spending gold is just painful. None of the endgame goals are interesting or fun to work towards since they almost provide no reward worth the time and effort you have to put in to complete them. If doing literally anything in this game was fun, I might be able to excuse it, but I can't. Everything, from moving to crafting to talking, is just really clumsy and slow and not rewarding at all. The farming is slow and honestly not that rewarding. The mining is slow and really boring. The fighting is slow and frustrating. The fishing is slow and not rewarding. And foraging is a nothing skill. What is there for you to do in this game that's fun? Miscellaneous. Okay, we're out of the big points now, so let's go through all of the smaller points that need work. Number 1, or well, these don't need to be numbered at all. The shipping bin only shows the last item you put in it, which means that if you dump a bunch of stuff into your bin, you won't be able to recover anything from it except for the last item. Ironically, with the new update they've added a small shipping bin, which functions like a 9-slot chest which sells the contents at the end of the day. You can freely look inside of this chest and take anything you want in or out of it, which just sort of begs the question, why didn't they do this with the actual shipping bin? Your inventory space is super limited, and the bag upgrades early on are a huge money and time sink. You get a ton of items in Stardew because of seasonal restrictions and quests. You tend to hold on to stuff for as long as possible in case you need them later. The maximum inventory space in this game is 36 slots, but a good chunk of these slots were going to be taken up by tools and food you need when you go mining. Overall, it feels like you're really strapped for inventory space in this game. This game only saves in between the 2 days when you sleep. If you feel like putting the game down halfway through the day, you have to decide between finishing the rest of the day or redoing it the next time you start the game. Prices at Pierre's shop as well as Robin's shop increase after the first year. I don't understand why this is in the game. By this point, you've already established enough money to sow your fields, so the increase in price really just serves to slow you down even more as you work towards your obelisks and golden clock. It's even worse for Robin, since at this point you're going to want to afford all the materials for the kegs, and you're actually going to be using more wood than you can chop down in the forest, so you'll be forced to buy materials from her. Shops close partway through the day, and on certain days of the week they won't open at all. What else do I need to say about this? It's just annoying, and hilariously, Pierre will close his shop at 6, but he leaves the counter at 5, meaning that if you enter the shop at 5 and he isn't at the register, you still can't shop at his store despite it being before 6, because no one's there to manage the register. Of course, Pierre is still standing in the shop and you can talk to him, but you can't buy anything from him. If you complete the community center, Pierre won't close on Wednesdays, but this doesn't change the fact that he closes way too early. And also, Clint will start closing on Fridays since he visits the community center, which is almost worse because at this point in the game, you're probably buying ore from him in order to make your kegs and other materials. Special orders and quests sometimes ask for you to gather materials. For what I can only assume is a balancing reason, these quests only track your progress after you've accepted it. A classic example of this since the very beginning of this game's inception is Clint asking for copper ore. You'd think that all you have to do is grab copper ore out of your chest and that's that, but nope. You have to gather the amount of copper from the mines after taking the quest in order to hand it in. Otherwise, you accidentally gift Clint copper ore, and guess what? Copper ore is one of the gifts he hates. Yes, the blacksmith hates copper ore. When you get a bonus item from foraging because of skills, the extra item doesn't count towards requests. It's just another slap in the face, and it's likely an oversight with how the game handles tracking quest progress, since it's very clearly designed to only increase the amounts needed from certain actions to prevent you from completing quests with items you had in storage, which would be the more logical things to do for this kind of quest, but I guess that would have been too fun. On a very similar note, NPC gift preferences have a lot of discrepancies. Copper ore is hated by everyone, but copper bars are liked by Clint and Maru. Abigail likes blackberry cobbler, but she hates blackberries on their own. If you just look at the wiki, you can find tons of examples that are like this, and it just doesn't make sense. Haley likes fruit salads, but she dislikes blueberries and melons, two of the ingredients that are in a fruit salad. It just kind of shows that no one put a lot of thought into making this. Random requests have a time limit on them, and they're usually not worth the hassle in the early to mid-game because of how much effort you have to put in to finish them. They're better saved for the endgame when you're trying to max out friendship with every villager, and you have all the time and resources you need to complete these requests within the time limits. On a related note, any quest that involves farming a specific monster is usually not worth it. It's all down to RNG whether or not you get the enemy to spawn, and while this might not be a problem for just 1 or 2 monsters, some special orders require you to kill tons of monsters. This goes hand in hand with the monster eradication tasks. Farming a lot of a single monster should be easy, but because of RNG in the mines, you can't always guarantee these monsters will spawn, so it becomes a chore. Lightning rods are required to prevent lightning from destroying crops on your farm, but they also require a certain level of foraging to craft, so in the early game if you can't craft these, you'll inevitably lose some crops. I can also confirm that even with lightning rods, you still lose some crops now and then. You don't start the game with a calendar, you have to buy one from Robin if you want to read the date from home. Otherwise, you have to walk all the way to the town plaza to go up to Pierre's to read the calendar that's there. You also still have to go up to Pierre's to check the calendar and as well as check requests from villagers, so kinda defeats the purpose of having a mailbox. Of all the things they could have taken from Harvest Moon, starting with a calendar was one of them, and they didn't. Villagers destroy anything they walk into while you're out of town. This isn't a big deal because you would almost never put a machine out in the middle of a road, but it's indicative of the rigidity of the NPC's movement pattern. They can't path around these things, they'll just destroy whatever they come into like they're a fucking Exodia. Okay, now here's a small thing, and I'm not going to call this a real criticism, but I want to mention how oddly inappropriate some of the writing is in this game. Now, I'm not going to go all PC police on you, but the quest from Lewis to get his shorts from Marnie's home, and the event where you find Lewis and Marnie in a bush is clearly implying something is going on between them. There's also a rare text bubble that shows up if you walk into Robin's shop, where she assumes you're Lewis, which has some implications of its own considering Robin's a married woman. You also have the fact that Pam, who's an alcoholic, is the only person who will man the bus. Yes, the bus driver is an alcoholic. And of course, there's the classic quest you get from Demetrius, the only black guy in the game, asking you for 1 melon. Not all forageables grant EXP. As it turned out, the foraging skill might as well be called the woodcutting skill, because you get most of your XP from cutting down trees and stumps. Foraged items are so worthless outside of just eating them for energy in the early game, and they're way too uncommon to count as a source of income or experience for leveling this skill. There is no way, as far as I know, to check the stats of a crop that is planted. Now, there isn't a whole lot to check to begin with, but it would be nice to know what phase of growth a plant is on or what kind of fertilizer is on the soil. The only other way to tell this is to look at the plant or the soil and just determine from the sprite what it is. Festivals end the day immediately once they're over. Most festivals also block access to the town in its entirety, making it impossible to do any normal activities on the day that festivals take place in the town center. What's most confusing is that the Night Market Festival allows you to freely enter and exit at any time, so why isn't this the case with every festival? For what reason is the Super Cucumber so difficult to catch? It is the most infuriating thing I've ever done in this game. I don't understand why the Sea Cucumber is this difficult to catch. I hate fishing enough, but every time I have to deal with this, the most spazzy thing I've ever seen for a solid minute before finding out all I caught was a purple sponge, it's just disappointing and frustrating. Have you seen a sea cucumber before? You probably haven't, but I doubt that it would be able to catch one on a fishing line and that it would move this swiftly. Once you unlock the movie theater, you'll find out that you can't go into the theater more than once in a single sitting because your character refuses to see the same movie twice. This hinders your ability to increase your friendship just a little bit more. And also the crane game in the theater is terrible. You also have a chance to just not be able to use the crane game if some fat ass is hogging it. On a similar note, there's a game of darts which is required for perfection, but for whatever reason, actually finding this game is really difficult. Oh, and in case you were wondering, the darts minigame is extremely easy with your mouse controls, and it takes almost no time to do, but because of the specific requirements you have to fulfill in order to actually play the game, you probably won't even know that it exists. To actually find it, you need to go to the island beach shore, go to the east side, on an even-numbered day, with clear skies, past 8 PM, and you go into a cave. Oh yeah, and the system they have for hinting you at where to find these golden walnuts? Yeah, there isn't one for this. You just have to know that this exists. Getting all of the artifacts sucks, since it's completely RNG whether or not you'll get ones you need from dig spots or from breaking geodes. There's nothing else I can say about this. It is literally just RNG, and it's required for 100% completion. Artifacts and minerals collected show up in your character's collection screen to show you that you've gotten them before, but this doesn't mean that you've donated that item to the museum. This can be a problem if you, like me and Rick, ended up with a discrepancy between what you see in your collection and what's been donated in the museum. This is especially true for the common gems, which don't have a not donated yet text description, so it's easy to forget them when you're trying to complete the museum. Items you receive as gifts or rewards can't be taken with you if you have no inventory space. For some reason, you can't use any of the storage space the item comes in to organize your storage, which forces you to discard a one item to take it. This has been an issue since the game was first released, and it's still an issue. 1.5 Stardew introduces the new Ginger Island for you to explore after you complete the community center. Yep, you have to beat the entirety of vanilla Stardew before you can access the new content, so it might as well not even exist until then. In order to access the island, you need to complete a small quest for Willy to repair his boat. The good news is that Ginger Island contains a farm plot which allows you to grow any crop on it, and doesn't require scarecrows, which is nice. The extra farmland essentially acts as a way to accelerate the money gain, since you can fill it all with ancient fruits and leave it be. Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot else I can say good about Ginger Island. Firstly, the toll. There's a toll of 1,000 gold in order to take the boat to the island. Let's forget the fact that you already lost thousands of gold worth of resources in order to repair the boat to begin with. The real issue here is that the boat ride can only happen at Willy's shop. Even factoring in the minecart shortcut you can take, it still takes an obnoxiously long time to travel between the two areas. There's even a cutscene that plays each time that you have to skip yourself. The constant amount of travel time becomes an issue once you establish a farm, as you now have 2 farms to keep track of. In addition to this, storage isn't connected in any way between the 2 farms, meaning that if you forget to bring something to the island or vice versa, you have to make the trip between the 2 places, which takes so much time. If it wasn't clear to you by now how much of a problem the slow speed and time restrictions were, it should be now. It's far more difficult to go to shops before they close if you decide to go to the island first thing in the day, and it's even more difficult to clear the volcano dungeon in time if you go later in the day. Speaking of closing, Willy's shop still closes at its normal times, meaning that you'll be locked out of the island past 5 in the noon, and it's completely inaccessible during festivals. Outside of the teleport totems, the best way to travel to and from the island is using the obelisk. However, the island obelisk costs 1,000,000 gold to make, and the farm obelisk requires you to collect a large sum of walnuts in order to build, and neither of them are particularly useful without the other. The island farm is seasonal, which is good, but between seasons, weeds will grow on the farm and potentially destroy crops you've planted with little warning. Again, because of travel restrictions, you might not notice this in time to rescue your crops. Let's talk about that volcano dungeon I mentioned. Essentially, the volcano is a 10-floor dungeon with the same kind of ore as the Skull Cavern, with the inclusion of cinder shards, a new material for upgrading your tools further. While 10 floors doesn't sound all that bad, you do not have a lot of time to complete this dungeon in a single run, and you will have to do it in a single run. The only guaranteed reward you can get for completing this dungeon is by going to the last floor, which means you have to do it all in one go. While you can unlock a shortcut that lets you get out of the dungeon on the 5th floor, the only other way to leave besides that is to walk out on your own or to use a totem. What this amounts to is that you need to make sure you have enough time to complete the dungeon, or at least have enough time to get out of the dungeon, or you'll be forced to pass out halfway through. On top of this, the enemies suck balls again. The slimes, just as tanky as the Iron Skull Cavern, deal even more damage than before. Serpents are replaced with a floating flame which circle around and dive into you. Some of them can even dash quickly into you. At least you're getting good value out of your sword's parry, but still, they deal a ton of damage, and of course, they fly away when you hit them, wasting even more of your time. One of the worst enemy designs is just a ripoff of Zora from Legend of Zelda. They pop their heads out of the lava and shoot fireballs at you. Since they float in lava, you can't really hit them at all, so you just have to deal with it. At the top of the volcano contains a forge, which you use to upgrade your tools even further. You can enchant your tools with a special effect using a prismatic shard, but the kicker is that you don't get to choose which effect you get. This leaves you at the mercy of RNG if you don't get the one that you want. While it's nice that the game prevents you from getting the last 2 enchantments you've seen, the enchantment is still ridiculously expensive for how random it is for you to get them. Most of the enchantments aren't even that good, by the way. Almost all of the unlockables on Ginger Island are gated behind golden walnuts, which you have to find around the island. Some are hidden and must be dug up, while others are gone from the volcano's random drops or from fishing. While this might have been cool for secrets, it's not when these walnuts are required for the progression of the game. Lots of walnuts are really well hidden, so well hidden that finding them might as well require a guide. Again, I wouldn't mind if this wasn't required for progression, but they are. You can't even sleep on the island without getting enough walnuts first, so you need some to get started. To compound this issue, lots of walnuts are hidden behind puzzles with additional restrictions. One of the puzzles can only be solved with flute blocks, which requires you to have friendship with Robin to craft. Not that you know that, the game doesn't tell you to use flute blocks. Another puzzle requires you to go 3 crops, a melon, a wheat, a garlic, and then talk to the frog in the cave near your farm. The kicker is that he only tells you about the melon first, which is a summer crop, but of course, garlic is a spring crop, meaning that once you give him the melon, he'll tell you about the wheat, you'll grow that, and then he'll tell you about the garlic. Uh-oh, that's a spring crop, and Pierre doesn't sell spring crops unless it's spring. So unless you have some lying around, or you got the upgrade to buy crops in any season, you have to wait until spring to get garlic to finish this quest. At the very least, if you were a pack rat and saved some garlic, you can toss it into your seed maker to make some more seeds. Oh yeah, and I might have forgotten to mention that you have to grow the crops on the island. You don't give it to the frog, he just has to see them grown on the island, so no, you can't just give him the garlic, that doesn't count. There is one saving grace with the walnuts, and that's the parrot in the jungle. You can get 1 hint per day about where unclaimed walnuts might be. Yes, you get 1 hint, and it's a vague and useless hint as you might expect. You usually get a number of walnuts where you haven't dug up in a section of the island, but of course you don't know where they are, and there's no way to tell which walnuts you've already found, so you end up checking the same spots over and over again. The real purpose of Ginger Island is to unlock Key's secret room by collecting at least 100 golden walnuts. Key's room offers 2 important features, the Perfection Tracker and Key's Quest. The Perfection Tracker finally gives you a concrete objective to be working towards outside of becoming rich. Key's quests, on the other hand, are definitely a mixed bag. The quests themselves are significantly more difficult than your average quest, but these are the only way of gathering a large number of key gems, another new currency used to buy most of the endgame items added in this update. It's funny how important getting money is for the base game, but then you get to the island and none of it is useful. All of the island upgrades require walnuts, all of the special items cost gems, all of the traders on the islands use random items instead of money. While you can bypass a number of the Key's quests by spending a lot of money, some of them are just plain ridiculous. You might need to grow a large number of useless key beans, resulting in extreme income losses, or you might need to fish up a set of legendary fish, or how about getting 3 prismatic shards? It's not something you can even work towards, you're just basically mining and fighting and hoping that you'll get the RNG drops. And what are these endgame items that are so worth working towards? Spend 50 gems to summon your horse wherever you are. How about just letting me walk faster for 50 gems? Pierre's stock list lets you buy out all of the season's crops, but you'll get it so far past the game's completion that why would you actually need to buy any crop? You can get sprinkler upgrades, but they're so minor and you'd have to reorganize your entire farm just to account for the new ranges. You can get an item that lets you go into any house at any time of the day, but what good is that? Literally, what can you do besides talk to NPCs inside of their own homes? You can buy a Junimo chest, which has persistent storage across multiple Junimo chests. This would have been really helpful when you're traveling between town and the island, but you spend so much time on the island before you can even unlock it that it's just wasted. You probably have at least one of the obelisks by then, and that still doesn't solve the core issue with the storage system in the game already. You can get heavy tappers, which sound nice, but ignoring the fact that again, these come way too late in the game, the materials you need to make these require you to unlock the hard mode mines, and this in turn requires you to complete a specific quest from Key. And again, why would you bother with heavy tappers? You've already made so many tappers at this point, why would you need to upgrade them? You not only need to unlock the recipe for the heavy tapper, you need to unlock the hard mode mines, and then you need to go into the mines and farm all of the materials you need to finally craft all of the heavy tappers to replace your old ones. Aren't these supposed to be the endgame rewards, the fruits of my labor for all of the hard work I've put in? And it's just more work to get an upgraded tool that we've already used? One more fun fact. If Pam decides she wants to visit the island on any given day, she won't be there to drive the bus to the desert. This is very rarely a problem, but it's still an issue. One of the completion goals in this game is to hunt a certain number of enemies. Some of the enemies you need to hunt are in Skull Cave, and sometimes you just want to go into Skull Cave to get Iridium. If Pam is at the island, well, I guess sucks to suck. You're not going to the desert unless you have a totem or you've already unlocked the obelisk. Of course, if you teleport to the desert, and Pam decided she was going to the island, the bus will still be there. Why is this supposed to be something tied to Pam if you're just gonna let me go back on the bus regardless? Just have it be a nameless NPC that doesn't take up space in the town, and doesn't follow a schedule that can be screwed up because of RNG. Gus opens a shop on the island when he visits, and some of the items you need for completion he sells there. There is no indication that Gus opens a shop on the island. I didn't even know that this was a thing until Rick pointed it out, since he was looking at the wiki. Of course, if the weather is bad, Gus won't open a shop, and if he's not at the island, well, he can't open a shop either. Oh yeah, and by the way, obelisks are one-way teleports. If you want to go back to the farm after using your obelisk, the only option besides using a totem to go back to the farm is to walk there. You spend millions of gold and resources making these obelisks, and they don't even have the courtesy to work both ways. As I said in the beginning, Stardew disappointed me. It disappointed me because of all the stuff I mentioned in the video so far, all of these flaws. Some of these are fundamental issues, and others are minor, but the game has had all the time in the world to improve that it just doesn't make sense why it's still like this, and why the game still has such rave reviews even to this day. Stardew has been out for 5 years. 5 whole years the development team had to soak up in their glory and patch the problems the game's had. And what's been improved? Outside of some bug fixes and balance changes, I can't think of much. Simple additions like villager locations on the map and letting you open the shipping container to take things out of it are still not implemented, and I don't understand why this is the case. The new content in 1.5 isn't accessible until you complete the community center, so whatever brand new exciting content there is isn't going to affect you until hours and hours into your playthrough, leaving you to deal with the unpolished early to mid game to deal with. While this is only speculation and not hard conclusive data, if you look at Steam's global achievement tracker, you can see some pretty interesting stuff here. Less than 20% of people have the achievement for completing the community center. Maybe the vast majority of the player base just plays offline where they can't get achievements, but that's a significant portion of the game's player base, not even beating the mid-game. About a quarter of players have made 1 million gold. To put that in perspective, in my playthrough we reached a total of 1 million before the 3rd year. You need to spend a minimum of 13 million gold alone on obelisks and the golden clock for 100% completion. I could go on, but I don't want to harp on the achievement progress like it's hard data, but it does seem to imply that a vast majority of Stardew's players just get bored during the early game and stop. Stardew just has a very boring gameplay loop, and none of its mechanics are geared towards the player being able to do anything in a quick and satisfying way. Farming is slow and painful when you're just starting out, but becomes mindless and engaging when you have sprinklers set up. Mining is slow and is heavily reliant on RNG, combat is a slog and nothing short of button mashing, foraging is basically a nothing activity where you just click on trees and running around the woods. Fishing is painful, time consuming, and it's hardly rewarding at all, and the writing of the NPCs in the early game is super boring and forgettable. All of this hits home sooner or later. My multiplayer partner Rick had never played Stardew Valley past the first year of summer on his own. By the time we reached the second year of fall, all we were doing was leveling up our skills and building up friendship levels and tending to the farm at the start of every season. All of a sudden we were going to bed earlier in the day because there just wasn't a whole lot to do anymore. The farm was mostly automated, and we didn't need to do anything in the mines or do much combat, so it's no wonder people quit so early into the game. They just get bored. It's not engaging, and the endgame goals the player would have to strive for aren't there, and when you do get there, it's just not fun to work towards either. How it could be better. So why did I make this video? It's not because I have some kind of boiling rage against the developer in the game. I'll say it right now, Stardew Valley is not the worst thing ever. Considering the effort that's gone in the finished product, it's working, it's relatively free from bugs, and that's a lot more than can be said for most AAA games we see today. But as impressive as it is, I wanted to make this video because the game is flawed. It's flawed in so many ways that I would discourage you from playing it, because there is another game that you can play instead. A series that has been going for decades before Stardew Valley came out and had better gameplay and fixed many of the flaws Stardew had to this day, and 5 years later, long before it ever came out. The series is called Rune Factory. To be specific, the most recent game is the 4th one. If you're not familiar, Rune Factory is a series of games originally published by Marvelous, the same people who brought you games like No More Heroes. Marvelous developed Story of Seasons, but the game was first published in North America by Natsume as Harvest Moon, and Rune Factory gets its subtitle, A Fantasy Harvest Moon, from this. Natsume still holds the rights to the Harvest Moon name, but not the franchise that Marvelous originally created. So confusingly, the Harvest Moon franchise has been split into 2. Harvest Moon, owned by Natsume, who still make Harvest Moon games, and A Story of Seasons, owned by Marvelous, who also still make Story of Seasons games. As its old tagline might suggest, Rune Factory was created as a spin-off of Story of Seasons, but has some key differences, such as the titular runes, which are essentially magic, and the implementation of combat, something that Story of Seasons never really has had. Coincidentally, Stardew Valley and Rune Factory share much more in common as opposed to with Story of Seasons, having greater emphasis on RPG-style skill levels and combat using equipment. But as similar as they are, Rune Factory 4, and even to a lesser extent 3, is and has been much better than Stardew in nearly every facet. How so? Allow me to explain. Presentation. The music in Stardew Valley doesn't play very often, and as a result it isn't very memorable. Even when it does play, it goes away after a single loop. Rune Factory's music plays all the time with catchy melodies. You never get annoying to hear after playing the game for hours on end, and you'll most likely just end up humming along as you start to memorize the songs. Of course, taste in music is quite subjective, so if you disagree with me, I'll let you decide for yourself by comparing the music here. Keep in mind that I'll be directly comparing the music. In actual gameplay, Stardew Valley is dead silent half of the time.
Hi.
Farming. Trellis and Stardew block you from moving through them, but there are no crops in Rune Factory that do this. Not even trees really block you that much, since you can walk in between them. Tree taps are required for your progression in Stardew, and you can't buy them, which bottlenecks your ability to make things like kegs. In Rune Factory, while you can't buy all materials consistently, you can buy some materials from certain shops, and farming them is really easy. Scarecrows are a necessity in Stardew, and they aren't unlocked initially, so you might lose some crops, and of course, these scarecrows take up space and are just one more thing for you to think about. Rune Factory doesn't make you worry about this kind of thing. They just don't exist. Animals in Stardew die if you leave them outside overnight, which is unlikely since there's no penalty for leaving the doors open, but it's worth mentioning since it's just a mechanic that just serves to punish players. Of course, Rune Factory doesn't do this. The monsters you tame in Rune Factory are capable enough of fighting on their own. Fences degrade in Stardew, and weeds can grow over crops and destroy them randomly. None of your stuff degrades in Rune Factory, and crops can only be destroyed by Typhoon, a mildly rare occurrence that you can defend against using wettable powders, or you can completely avoid by just pushing them away in Rune Factory 4. Grass in Stardew is finicky, and the silo mechanics are annoying. In Rune Factory, instead of having hay, you have fodder, a crop that you can grow in basically any season, and you don't have to replant it. You place your fodder into a fodder bin, which has effectively infinite storage space, and instead of having to feed your animals directly, it just deducts the amount of fodder you need from this fodder bin. Crops in Stardew die immediately when out of season. In Rune Factory, crops that are out of season grow slower and produce fewer crops, but will survive nonetheless. Usually, the only way for crops to die is for you to just not watering them. In Stardew, you can't buy seeds out of season without a special item from key gems. In Rune Factory, you can buy seeds from any season at any time, so you just have to unlock them first, either by finding them out in the world or by completing requests. They also don't cost more for being out of season like they do in Stardew. Stardew's greenhouse is an upgrade that comes too late in the game to help you actually do anything, like completing bundles, and the garden pots you unlock are completely useless. Rune Factory has seasonal farm plots that you can unlock by simply visiting them. In 4, you can teleport to these plots really easily, and because of this, you can grow a wider variety of seeds in the early game and not have to worry about not being able to grow them, because you have access to a plot of land to grow them in. This is of course ignoring the fact that you can grow crops in any season regardless, the only penalty being 1 to the amount you can harvest afterwards. In Stardew, you have to pick between bats or mushrooms in your cave. In Rune Factory, you don't have to make this kind of choice and the game doesn't screw you out. Fruits can easily be found out in the world or dropped from monsters. You can also grow them very easily or buy them from shops. Production machines in Stardew have expensive costs, like oak resin for kegs. Because of this, getting a large amount of machines requires you to spend a lot of time preparing material farms, which gets tedious and slows down the pace of the game. In Rune Factory, every crafting station can be made with money, stone, and wood, materials that are easily farmed in the early game. In Stardew, you can't put fertilizer on crops that have grown past their first stage. In Rune Factory, you can put tons of chemicals on crops at any given time in order to improve their stats, because the chemicals are tied to the soil, not the crop. Stardew has tree fertilizer, but it can't be used on fruit trees. Meanwhile, Rune Factory's fruit trees use the same stats as normal crops, which kills 2 birds with 1 stone. The trees don't need a specialized item and recipe, and the trees grow faster if you give them whatever chemicals you have. On a similar note, Rune Factory's crops and soil have many more stats when compared to Stardew. You can view these stats with a magnifying glass, which you can't do in Stardew, to my knowledge. The many stats give the farming a little bit more depth in Rune Factory compared to Stardew, as well as the ability to grow crops much faster and to grow giant crops much more consistently compared to Stardew. I didn't mention this because in Stardew, to grow a giant crop, you just need to create a certain square of crops and then pray to RNGesus that you'll get the giant crop. Crafting. Stardew's chest-based storage is a nightmare when you start to stockpile tons of items for future crafting. Rune Factory has the storage bin, a single chest that you store basically everything in. You also have the refrigerator for food items and crops. The storage bin has over 400 slots for items in, and the storage is persistent among multiple storage bins. Crafting in Stardew requires you to have all the items in your inventory, whereas in Rune Factory, crafting at a station allows you to use items from your storage bin or refrigerator, regardless of where those are in relation to where the crafting station is. Using production machines like furnaces in Stardew means having to wait around. In Rune Factory, there's a short animation, and you can even skip this in 4, and it takes no in-game time to do. In Stardew, upgrading your tools means visiting Clint, and that also means losing your tool for the rest of the day, the next day, and until you pick it up the day after. Upgrading your tools in Rune Factory can be done at a forge, which you own, and there's no downtime to this. Fishing. Fishing in Stardew is slow and difficult considering what you'll get out of it. In Rune Factory, there's no minigame. All you have to do is press the B button when the fish bites, get it right, and you'll catch it. Easy as that. As you level up your fishing, fish become more easy to catch as the window for you to press the B button becomes more lenient. It's far more engaging than that terrible minigame in Stardew, despite being way more easier to do. Fish in Stardew are locked behind season, location, and weather. In Rune Factory, this is the same, but you can catch fish in any season by just going to the appropriate seasonal part of the world, and the weather has no bearing on the fish. So realistically, you can catch any fish you want at any time if you have the right areas unlocked. Bait in Stardew makes fish bite more often, which is pretty useless considering that fishing is already a pointless task. In Rune Factory, you can visually identify how many fish there are by just looking at the shadows in the water, and you can upgrade your rod to charge it to attract more fish from farther distances. Of course, if there aren't any fish in the pond you're looking at, you can just exit the area and walk back in to respawn them. Stardew's chest mechanic is poorly designed as it forces you to choose between catching your fish and catching the chest. In Rune Factory, if you catch a rare item instead of a fish, you just catch the item. That's it. Mining. Mining in Stardew is slow and tedious, and the latter RNG makes it even worse. In Rune Factory, dungeons are progressed through combat and the occasional puzzle solving, not by breaking rocks. If you want precious metals, you can usually find them in consistent spawn locations, and mining them is really fast with multiple strikes of a charged hammer. Combat. Stardew has lacking enemy variety, the vast majority of enemies simply dealing contact damage by walking, dashing, and flying into you. Rune Factory's enemies actually attack, with a variety of moves and projectiles. There are also challenging bosses for you to fight and endgame dungeons for you to travel through, something that Stardew sorely lacks. Stardew's weapons are swords, clubs, daggers, and the slingshot. In comparison, Rune Factory has swords and shields, great swords, dual blades, spears, hammers, axes, magic rods, and your bare hands as weapons. You also have magic spells that you can cast at any times, and rune abilities which essentially function as weapon skills, but you can use these with any weapon to spice up your combat. Each weapon has different attack properties and combos, so you can choose which one you like and use them. Swapping out your items in the heat of combat is difficult in Stardew because you have to fumble around with your hotbar using either your scroll wheel or by clicking or by using the number row on your keyboard. In Rune Factory, you just press the L button to go into your L pocket and grab any item you want while time is frozen. Stardew's combat has you swinging violently at the enemy, hoping that they'll just run right into you. This gets frustrating as you can only aim in 4 directions and enemies deal contact damage, and your attack animation pushes you into your enemy. In Rune Factory, if you stand still and attack, you'll usually automatically aim at the nearest enemy. You also have 360 degrees of motion, there's no contact damage, there's no fear of getting too close to your enemy, so combat just feels way more fluid. The Prismatic Shard in Stardew is required for getting the best weapon in the game. It's extremely uncommon to get, as it has a less than 1% drop chance at 0.01% from common enemies. In Rune Factory, the best equipment is surprisingly easy to get, as you can just craft them yourself using level appropriate materials, buy them in the store, or just win them from festivals. You can even get them as gifts. Story. Stardew's NPCs are vapid and boring, having some of the driest dialogue you can imagine. To be more specific, the issue here is that almost none of the dialogue is distinctive or interesting enough to remember. Now, if you think this is a very subjective thing to say, feel free to tell me, but let me do a comparison between the dialogue of the NPCs in Stardew and Rune Factory, and I want you to compare 2 things. Is this dialogue interesting enough that you could remember what was happening? And do you think that you could pinpoint which NPC said the line of dialogue? I understand that most people probably don't know all the NPCs from both games, and that's fine. I've played over 100 hours of Stardew, and I still don't know the NPCs' names because they're just so boring. But to help illustrate my point, I'll play a game I like to call Same or Different. It's a very simple game, and honestly the focus here isn't even the game itself, it's just the dialogue. I'll show you 2 dialogue prompts, and all you have to do is guess whether or not both dialogues came from the same person or 2 different people. What I want to show is that Stardew doesn't do nearly as good a job as characterizing its NPCs because their dialogue is rarely indicative of any specific traits or qualities that person might have. A lot of it is really generic, and even ignoring that, you might find a lot of the dialogue to be just plain boring. Even if you want to argue that I cherry-picked those examples, these are the dialogues that you'll see if you play these games. I literally played Rune Factory and just took dialogues I saw. It's important to note that during the playthrough, Rick was the one who took the responsibility of gaining full friendship with the town for the sake of perfection. The townsfolk will change their dialogue depending on how much friendship levels you have with them, so you might have thought that because I didn't have high levels, I was getting the boring dialogue. But as testified by Rick, he was still getting very boring dialogue consistently. Sandy, the desert shopkeeper, would constantly repeat her line about how her name isn't really Sandy. So clearly this raising his friendship levels didn't really do much to improve the volume or the variety of dialogue that the townspeople have. Even if I were to agree that Stardew's dialogue isn't as bad as I think it is, you still have the problem of being able to talk to NPCs in the first place. Unlike in Stardew, Rune Factory's NPCs constantly walk around and are visible on the map. You have much more of an incentive to actually talk to people since friendship doesn't decay in Rune Factory. and you can give a gift every day without limits, and the sheer amount of dialogue each NPC has keeps them interesting and keeps you coming back to see what they have to say. You've also probably noticed that Rune Factory's dialogues are way longer than Stardew's, and often has the player and other NPCs talking too, which makes it much more interesting. One thing you might notice about Rune Factory is that almost every shop has at least 2 NPCs to man the counter. This means that even if one of the shopkeepers is out in the town doing something, the other NPC is at the store. You can tell that this is done intentionally, because Bado in Rune Factory 4, who has no one to cover his store for him, lets you buy things from his shop using the honor system if he's not around. It sounds silly, but it allows the NPCs to go around the town and be more active, while also allowing the player to use the shop whenever they should be allowed to, given the hours of the store. It's difficult to know what NPCs like in Stardew because they rarely ever tell you their likes and dislikes. NPCs will occasionally tell you the likes and dislikes of other NPCs, but I've only ever been told their dislikes. If you give someone a gift in Rune Factory, if they didn't hate it, they'll usually tell you what kinds of things they like or dislike. A lot of the times, they'll even just mention this in casual dialogue. In addition to this, before someone's birthday, other people around town will tell you about the kinds of gifts they're going to give, which is a subtle nod as to what kinds of gifts you should be looking to give. Movement. Movement in Stardew is painfully slow, whereas in Rune Factory, it's extremely quick and free thanks to the dashing mechanic and just generally being quicker. In addition to this, you can teleport to different parts of the world by using the airship and go back home by using the return spell. Using the return spell is free and it's always with you, so you never have an excuse not to use it. Stardew's world is huge, and because of the slow speed, it makes it difficult to travel around. Rune Factory's towns are small enough to make traveling easy, but large enough to be interesting and provide space for the NPCs to move around. To give you an idea of how different movement is in both of these games, let's just do a direct comparison of some common routes to be taking in both games.
3, 2, 1, go!
As you mentioned before, Stardew's clock isn't one-to-one with real life. Rune Factory's is, with 1 second to 1 in-game minute. Not only do you have more time to work with in Rune Factory, but there's no time restrictions placed on you. Nothing happens if you stay up too late, or even stay up an entire night into the next day. The only penalty that can be incurred is if you stay up for multiple nights in a row, in which case you'll get status ailments like a fatigue or getting a cold. Both of which can be cured really easily with items, or by seeing a doctor, or by resting. You even level up your sleeping skill by resting in bed, so you have more of an excuse to actually sleep, but without any of the punishment that Stardew would incur on you for going to bed too late. Pacing and progression. Progression in Stardew is largely centered around finishing the community bundles and making a bunch of money. This dictates what you'll be doing in the early to mid game in order to complete the bundles and improve the farm as quickly as you can. Then, when the end game hits, the pace tanks completely in favor of money grinding. In comparison, Rune Factory's pacing is centered around equipment and skill levels. Equipment can easily be earned as gifts, rewards from requests from shops, or just crafting it yourself. Because most skills raise your stats, you can do whatever you want and get lots of stat gains which can benefit you in other parts of the games, rather than being railroaded into just grinding for money. In Rune Factory, you can even ignore the main story and just play within the town until you've progressed as far as you can on your own, farming with quests and making friendships. All of the stats and resources you gain from working in town can then be utilized elsewhere for exploration and combat. If you were to try the same stuff in Stardew, you'd quickly be gated off by community bundles, crafting recipes, and requests due to the lack of resources from the mines. That's not to say that this is the intended way to play, but that's to say that you need to play in a specific way in Stardew in order to progress efficiently and not lock yourself out of stuff due to the seasons changing. But in Rune Factory, you can progress by just playing in any way and stocking up on level up stats and items along the way. Winter is a complete dead zone in Stardew, basically relegated to fishing and tool upgrading. In Rune Factory, there's a handful of valuable crops which only grow in winter, which gives you more things to do in the meantime. Again, Because of how Stardew is paced, you probably use winter to grind fishing and foraging levels because you need to spend the early game earning money and metals from the mines for upgrades. In Rune Factory, you don't need to be so picky about when you should be doing something in particular, because you can just do it about any season and still progress. Stardew becomes a slog during the mid to late game because of the lack of things to do. Once you've maxed out your skills, you can ignore them for favor of grinding money and buying resources when you don't have time to spare. The endgame goals like catching all the fish and getting all the monoliths take nothing more than time, which leaves you with a lot of repetition in catching fish, or just tending to your farm. Rune Factory 4 has lots of dungeons for you to work towards beating at different points in the game, and even some post-game dungeons like the Rune Prana and the Sharon's Branch, which are very difficult to beat with tons of great materials inside. Restoring energy in Stardew is really hard to do early in the game, which is ironically the time you need to do the most since you'll be torn between tending to the farms and going mining. In Rune Factory, visiting the sauna is fast and easy with a paltry fee to pay for instant regeneration. In contrast, the sauna in Stardew takes ages to walk to, and you still have to stand in the sauna for the regeneration to happen. Then you have to walk all the way back to what you were doing. Rune Factory also gives us more ways to regenerate stamina by eating food that's easy to get, or just by finding energy restoring crystals and flowers out in the world. Raising your stamina in Stardew requires you to get star drops, which have specific requirements to get, and at a certain point just sort of tapers off as you don't need that much stamina to begin with in the late game. In Rune Factory, all you have to do is raise skills, which increase your stamina, and you'll get more stamina, so it naturally increases as you get to more difficult dungeons and do more stamina-intensive tasks. Miscellaneous. The shipping bin sucks in Stardew, but it's great in Rune Factory 4. You can see what items you put in, and you can take them out at your leisure, and it has a really big inventory space. You have 36 slots of inventory space in Stardew, but you get up to 60 in Rune Factory, which is good considering you have way more stuff in Rune Factory 4. Stardew Valley only saves in between days, but Rune Factory allows you to save at any time as long as you can find a save point. In Stardew Valley, shop items increase in price in the second year, but they don't ever do this in Rune Factory. Quests in Stardew often require you to gather materials from scratch and deliver them. In comparison, Rune Factory doesn't, and if you have the requested items, you can usually just deliver them immediately. Requests have a time limit in Stardew, but they don't in Rune Factory. Have fun farming monsters for requests when the monsters spawn at random, and you waste so much time looking for ladders in Stardew. In Rune Factory, the monsters needed for requests will have a specified location, and you can usually reset the spawns easily by just walking in and out of the map zone. Stardew Valley doesn't start you off with a calendar, but Rune Factory does. Rune Factory's calendar is even better, since you can look at future and past seasons to see what's coming up and what's just happened. NPCs in Stardew destroy objects they walk into out in the town, but in Rune Factory they won't, and they can path around things that they would otherwise get stuck on. Hilariously enough, in Stardew your spouse can get stuck on furniture in the house, but won't destroy them, which can often leave them stuck in the home doing nothing. Festivals in Stardew end the day immediately, but in Rune Factory you're free to walk around the town and you can even visit shops most of the time. So we've gone over a bunch of examples again, and hopefully I've conveyed just some of the ways that Rune Factory manages to improve on Stardew's many flaws. Now let me be fair here, Rune Factory is by no means a perfect series, and it once suffered from some of the many problems that Stardew has now. In Rune Factory 3, your inventory space was incredibly small, and the storage chest wasn't any better. You couldn't look into shipping containers, most of the furniture couldn't be moved, all of the seasonal plots were way out of the way, there's a limit on how many things can be on screen at the same time, and there's a ton of mechanics in the game that just aren't explained to you at all. There's a lot of little things here to complain about, but when it comes to the big picture, there's way more here that's wrong with Stardew than there is with Rune Factory. And more importantly is that Rune Factory has managed to improve over the years. Rune Factory 3 released in 2009, while 4 released in 2013 of the same month, just 4 years apart. In that time, there were multiple spin-off games, and many of the problems present in 3 were fixed by the time we got to 4. Inventory space was massively expanded, you could look into shipping containers, all the furniture could be moved, the seasonal plots can be warped to. All of these were issues, and they were fixed. Whereas Stardew Valley not only failed to succeed where Rune Factory had already found the right answers, but failed to improve on many of the game's minor and major flaws in more time than it took for Rune Factory 4 to come out after 3. Here's where you might be saying that Stardew Valley has tons of mods which improve the game and make it better. There's a few problems with this argument. First, I am judging the game based on how it was released by the developer, and how everyone is going to be able to experience it right out of the box. Modding the game changes the experience in some way, no matter how small that change might be, and I will likely not be using the same mod as anyone else, so there's no way for my opinion on a modded version of the game to be useful to anyone who didn't play the game with the exact same mods as I did. Second, Console players don't have access to these mods as far as I know, so there's no way for this argument to benefit them at all. Third, and most importantly, while I agree that the experience you have while playing is improved from modding the game, the core problems of the game will still be there without a complete overhaul of the game's systems. Unless you can find a mod that will fix all of the things that I've spoken of so far, the game will still be a drag to play. So fixing all of the little things isn't going to improve the game that much, nor will it improve my judgments on the game. And until the game is improved, I would encourage you to play the games which have been and are still improving to this day. I know a lot of people make a big deal about Stardew being a project by one, or maybe two people, but I don't, nor do I see how it's relevant in this argument. Do I think that it's impressive that a small team made a game like this? Sure I do. The game is at least not a smoking dumpster fire that so many AAA studios seem to put out on a regular basis. Do I think that elevates the quality of the game though? No, of course I don't. On one hand, if we believe that the quality of a product is completely independent of the number of people who worked on it, then the argument is irrelevant. The game isn't any better because one person made it. On the flip side, if you believe that the quality of a game is inversely related to the number of people who worked on it, then I find that hard to believe. I think that a bigger team can not only produce the same thing as a single person, but can do so much faster, which allows for more time to iterate and improve in the same time frame. Now don't get me wrong here, I'm not trying to throw shade at the developers themselves. They recently announced that they're starting a new project, and I honestly hope that the game goes well for them. Better games are good for everyone. The real reason why I wanted to make this video is because Rune Factory is a franchise that I really love, and I believe it's one of the best games in the genre of these sort of farming life simulation games. Yet the series nearly died with Rune Factory 4, and hasn't seen a resurgence in almost a decade since that game's original release. I don't understand how things turn out this way, and I hope that with the pre-C release of Rune Factory 4 and the upcoming release of Rune Factory 5, the series makes a comeback and shows us that we don't have to settle for the quality of games we got with Stardew Valley. Again, I'm not trying to throw the developer under the bus here specifically. Stardew Valley is at the very least a functioning game. It works, and it's relatively bug-free, and the game doesn't flat out lie to you about what it wants to be. I wanted to make this video to demonstrate my frustration with this game, and just how much greener the grass is on the other side.